Our original breed standard, written in 1897, said regarding color, the color should be uniform, pure of its kind, and brilliant. In regard to the color, preference should be given as follows: dark brindle, and white. All other brindles, all other colors. In brindle and solid colors, a small white patch on breast is not considered detrimental. A revision of the standard in 1903 addressed only weight classes and did not mention color. In 1906, some minor changes were made in the standard for the head, and the following was added: no discrimination should be made as to color, which removed the original preference that was to be given to dark brindle. In 1911, a special meeting of the FBDCA was held on May 1st to consider means to provide representation of the club at the Conference of French Bulldog Clubs of Europe, to be held in Paris, France, May 18th to 27, for the purpose of securing an agreement upon an international standard, and also to consider matters relative to possible changes or additions to the standard of the club that were to have been taken up at its next annual meeting of the club, the latter action being deemed advisable, so as to present the final recommendation of the club to the Paris Conference. The matter of the revision of the standard was therefore taken up. Reports of the Committee from FBDC of America, the FBDC of New England, and Western French Bulldog Club were presented and considered in detail, and after full and free discussion, each section of the standard was separately taken up and unanimously tentatively adopted, resulting in the final adoption of the following tentative standard. All brindles, dark preferred, and any color except the following which constitute disqualification: solid black, black and white, black and tan, liver and mouse color. Black as used in the standard means black without any trace of brindle. Disqualifications: other than bat ears, any mutilation, solid black, black and white, black and tan, liver and mouse color, eyes of different color, nose other than black and hair, sick lip. After final reading of the foregoing tentative standard, a motion was made, seconded, and carried as follows. Whereas the recommendation of the three committees on standard representing the FBDCA of AM, the FBDC of NE, and the Western French Bulldog Club have been considered and embodied in the foregoing tentative standard, therefore the Committee on Standard appointed by this club be empowered and authorized to take final action on the adoption of a standard for the club, either in agreement with the conclusions of the Paris Conference or independent of said body, and without waiting for the annual meeting of 1912. On motion duly made, seconded, and carried, it was decided that the FBDCOF-AM join the International Affiliation of European French Bulldog Clubs. Samuel Goldenberg, Nelcote Kennel, owner of the famous Nelcote Gammon, represented the American clubs at the Paris Conference in 1911. At that conference, the standard adopted by the Conference of FBD Clubs of Europe differed from the American one in several particulars, and so the FBDCA voted to adopt the standard drafted by its own standard committee on May 1, 1911. Mr. Goldenberg, less than a year later, was on the Titanic and was rescued and arrived in New York just a couple of days before judging Frenchies at our specialty show at the Waldorf Astoria on April 20, 1912.
This is the original French Bulldog breed standard as described by the French Bulldog Club of America in their catalog for their specialty in 1898. And what a lot of people don't know is that there originally were no disqualifications for colors. In fact, all colors were allowed. If you go to the FBDCA site, there is a document that describes the historical changes to the breed standard. And if you pay close attention, you'll see that in 1911, a special meeting was held on May 1st in 1911, and it was allegedly to align the FBDCA with an international standard, or at least that's the way it was presented. And one of the outcomes of this special meeting that was held without a vote is that certain colors were identified as disqualifications in the show ring. specifically any nose color other than black.
What is the meaning of this?
So anytime there's a policy change, in this case to a breed standard, a couple of key questions you have to ask yourself. What is the purity of the solution? What problem is being solved? And then, what is the motivation behind that change? Who benefits from that change the most? And that's why it's really important to look at the timeline of when this special rush meeting was held, initiated by Samuel L. Goldenberg. The FBDCA specialty had just been held on April 20th, 1911. And it was at this show that Mary won Best of Breed with Champion Pourquoi Pas. She actually knocked herself out of the Best of Breed competition with Champion Charlemagne of Amersham, who had just won Westminster and everybody thought for sure would be winning the FBDCA specialty. And a couple of things should be noted in that the judge of this show was Samuel Goldenberg, and pay particular attention to that title of President of the Society Canine des Savoirs, because that title was stripped of Mr. Goldenberg. As in, you're fired. You and your mustache. Sometime in 1911, Samuel Goldenberg and a few others formed their own French Bulldog club in France. And make no mistake, the parent club in France for Bulldogs was described in Waldner Comingus's book as being dissident. Samuel Goldenberg had named himself as the president and represented himself to the French Bulldog Club of America as such, as though he was an authority representing the opinion of others in France on behalf of the French Bulldog. But within just a couple of short months, it was discovered in France what he'd been up to by the other clubs, and they were outraged. They actually read about it in a magazine called The Breeder, and the date of that magazine was August 6th, 1911. And when they discovered that the president and 3 of the members of this competing club were also members of their own club, they considered this a serious offense. Goldenberg, acting as president, was singled out as serious misconduct and serious sanctions. This is actually the breed standard of the backdoor club that Goldenberg created, and it's his first attempt at making light eyes and noses a disqualification. Basically, Goldenberg created his own side club as a backdoor to implement standards that were being rejected by the parent club already existing in France, and he got caught. When they were called out at the meeting, only one member was present, and it wasn't Goldenberg. The Bulldog Club of France basically wasn't buying any of these explanations, and they informed Goldenberg that he was going to be forced to resign. Goldenberg responded with a letter saying that he had done nothing wrong.
How dare you?
And this is in January of 1912. So there's no doubt that he knew what he was doing when he was petitioning to the French Bulldog Club of America, that he already knew he was on his way out in France, that he'd lost his power. So his only hope of retaining power in the breed was to convince the French Bulldog Club of America that he was a man of power in Europe. And it's important to note the timeline of that because this was happening at the same time that Goldenberg was petitioning the FBDCA to have that special meeting without members being there to vote to implement a breed standard that he was presenting as being shared by everyone in France.
Nope.
And when you consider the contrast between the power and wealth between Goldenberg and the FBDCA members, and without the ability to verify things the way we can today with instant access on the internet, it's easy to see how it could appear that somebody had more authority than they really did. Safe to say that he was not a respected authority there. And in addition, what you'll find on the FBDCA website is a rather glorified statement about how Goldenberg is a prominent breeder and his dedication to the breed because he judged the 1912 specialty the day after arriving from being saved off the Titanic. But Goldenberg had actually been the judge the year before, and this year it was going to be William Lennox. Goldenberg was judging the side bet with 500 per side. Kind of embarrassing for the FBDCA when one of the mission statements is to educate the general public about the history of this breed, especially when this club is benefiting from a 501c7 tax shelter. And to make it worse, they talk all about the magazine that Mary Winthrop Turner actually edited, and yet there is zero representation of her anywhere on the FBDCA site, just Samuel L. Goldenberg.
What?
And if we're going to talk about the Titanic, there are a couple things that you should definitely know about Goldenberg and his activity at that time, but a little bit later. First, let's go back to 1911 and the president of the Society Canine de Savoie. As judge that year, Goldenberg chose champion Pourquoi Pas over champion Charlemagne of Amersham. Both champions were owned by Mary Winthrop Turner, but by doing so, champion Charlemagne of Amersham, who was at that point undefeated, had no chance to win best of breed. The sire of champion Pourquoi Pas was champion Nilcote Gammon. And according to the FBDCA site on the history of the breed, Samuel Goldenberg is given credit for being the owner of champion Nilcote Gammon, which he was briefly, really just long enough to affix the Nilcote kennel name to his registration. But in actuality, Goldenberg had dumped Nilcote Gammon before he was ever a champion, and probably because the breed standard had changed and didn't give preference to dark brindles anymore, so he lost that 5-point advantage. Regardless, it was the Purdy brothers that did all the heavy lifting with champion Nilcote Gammon, not Samuel Goldenberg. What many don't realize is that Frank Purdy and Mary Winthrop Turner worked together and collaborated extensively on several breedings. One example being the Scarlet Letter, whose name makes a lot of sense when you look at who her parents were. Mary and Frank Purdy had chosen to breed the two winners of the 1910 specialty, the disqualified Volatile and champion Nilcote Gammon, together. Mary then bred Scarlet Letter, the offspring of two winners of the 1910 specialty, back to her winner of the 1911 specialty, champion Pourquoi Pas. The result was a beautiful dog with a gorgeous head named Pourquoi Pas Perfection. These championship wins and breeding collaborations were all happening completely without Goldenberg. And now Mary had this undefeated international champion bred in the UK Basically, given the chance, Goldenberg snubbed Charlemagne of Amersham, a snub that it shocked the authors of magazines like Bit and Spur to write about it and the inconsistency in the judging. And so the dog that he chose was sired by his own former dog that has his kennel name affixed to the name. So, keeping that timeline in mind, here comes May 1st, just days after the FBDCA specialty. And one of the first things that's done is to reinstate the preference for dark brindle. So, here is the breed standard that was used in the 1911 FBDCA specialty with no discrimination made to color. And then after Goldenberg's influence, this is the breed standard with discrimination to color. And yes, that is the word that the FBDCA themselves use, discrimination. So a really interesting thing happened in the 1912 judging, and that is that a basically unknown dog named Gammon's Requette was awarded best of breed.
Uh-huh.
And he was chosen by Judge Lennox, but also in that side bet between Lawson and what should have been Mary Winthrop, but she was bumped out. It became between Lawson and Grant Notman's dog, Gammon's Requette, and they gave it to Gammon's Requette, and that was Goldenberg's decision. And you can see that Goldenberg is still passing himself off as the president of the Society of blah, blah, blah. And he'd already been kicked out. Like, he had already been kicked out before he got onto the Titanic with his dry carryall. One of the most disturbing news articles is from the New York Times, and it was right after the Carpathia had rescued the survivors. And they described Mr. Goldenberg calmly standing on the dock, and he's unharmed,
Hi.
he's unruffled, and he's standing there holding his carryall. And the customs officer says, "Hey, there's the only piece of baggage saved from the Titanic." And again, it's a 2x3 canvas carryall, right? And then another really important piece of information here is that Samuel Goldenberg was identified as a chairman of the Committee of Survivors, which issued a long statement to the press about the Carpathia landing, and yet he had nothing to say on his own part. Like, he went silent. In fact, he disappeared for a few days and was reported as missing while he was over at the French Bulldog Club of America show judging side bets for $500 a piece, 15,000 nowadays. So think about that for a second, because he's designated as in charge of all the other passengers. And he was on lifeboat number 5, which encountered lifeboat number 7. And Officer Pittman wanted to stop and help and pull in people from the water, but the passengers on board persuaded him not to do this. So that's chilling. And this was all well documented in the New York Times. And there was public outrage over this, especially when the news about the baggage being saved from the Titanic when 1,500 people were dead. And after several days of evading questions, and obviously after the dog show, Goldenberg finally issued a statement to the New York Times where he came up with a story about how that he had put two carpets into a small bag, one for him and one for his wife, which is really bizarre. Like, who's on a ship and they pack a bag of carpets? Uh, and actually, his story changes a lot, and he recruited his wife, well, ex-wife, now, Nella, to issue an alibi for him of sorts, where she made it sound like he didn't want to get onto the boat and she forced him to get on there. Now, let's just point out how well dressed Samuel Goldenberg is on the day of the show where he's judging the side bet, and how poorly dressed his wife is, who's normally exquisitely dressed. This 5'6" man somehow finds a perfectly tailored suit, and his much taller wife is wearing somebody's borrowed jacket. Apparently, Samuel Goldenberg suffered rheumatoid arthritis, which he claimed was from being on the Titanic, and he had an affair with the nurse that he needed for his arthritis, and he was caught.
Uh-oh.
And Nella was not going to have anything to do with that story. So she divorced him and ordered her children that his name could never be mentioned again. He was simply referred to as SLG. After Goldenberg's divorce from the nurse ended, he married a Polish noblewoman, and she painted a much more flattering picture of him. But this is where it gets really thick, because the claim is that Samuel Goldenberg suffered a nervous shock from being on the Titanic, and he was blind for 1 month. And that he promised himself that if he ever regained his vision, he would employ part of his real estate portfolio to help people that couldn't see. Yet, somehow, he could see perfectly fine when he was judging a $500 per side bet for the French Bulldog Club of America's specialty in 1912, where he implemented his new breed standard to disqualify his main competition and make sure that the American bred dogs that were offspring of his former dog that he imported were best of breed and not the English bred dog that had been imported. After the 1912 show, there were a lot of statements in the press from both Mary Winthrop Turner and from Mrs. Lawson. And Mary took it upon herself to correct the record. And she was right. One of the statements that she corrected was regarding Nellcote Gammon, and she pointed out that he had actually been defeated by both Charlemagne of Amersham and by Gammon's Requet. And of course, the most high profile defeat was from her own dog, Savolatile, who won that 1910 specialty, not champion Nellcote Gammon. He was actually first place loser, the reserve dog, and he was awarded the title when Savolatile was canceled. And there's documentation of how that protest went down and who was behind it, which was Mrs. Lipman and Mrs. Arnold Lawson. These are a couple of the fun pictures of Champion Gammon's Requet, who is described as a silver brindle, interestingly enough, and enchantress. Mary actually goes on to point out that in about 2 years, she had a record of 88 championship points and more blue ribbons and trophies than all the French Bulldog kennels in the country combined. With some of her most high profile winners being Champion Hunk's Bequest, Champion Parsk, and Champion the Dollar Princess. And this matches the reports from the press talking about her having more champions than any other breeder in all of America. Let's get to the fun stuff. Remember, Mary Winthrop Turner reversed her decision in the show ring, and they wrote about it a lot. And here's why. Remember that article where the men were recorded as saying a woman couldn't be trusted to be unbiased?
Women.
Mary knew exactly who was behind the breed standard change that made her dog a disqualification. And those behind that secret meeting never anticipated that a woman would be made judge of the 1913 Westminster show for French Bulldogs. Here's the real kicker. The year that they changed the breed standard, Samuel L. Goldenberg and his team put up a silver brindle Gammon's request. By conveniently picking an unknown dog sired by Goldenberg's former champion, not only did they bump Mary Winthrop Turner out of her chances of getting her third consecutive best of breed, but they also bumped Mrs. Arnold Lawson from doing the same. And here's where it gets fun, because at some point, Mary Winthrop Turner purchased Hunk's Bequest, the full litter mate to Gammon's request. By doing this, she gave herself an instant alibi for not having the bias that she normally would have. And like a true boss, she went to great lengths to outline exactly why she chose Fenway Frenchman, an unknown dog, over Gammon's request. And when you get into the details of what she wrote, she demonstrated her skill set and her expertise in judging the French Bulldog breed. And when you look at the catalog for Westminster 1913, it's very obvious that there was an opportunity for Mary Winthrop Turner to initially place Champion Gammon's request over Fenway Frenchman, thus giving the illusion that she was not having a bias. And it's not a mistake. She knew exactly how to orchestrate this. And there was an opportunity for her to still put up Gammon's request while also not placing him best of the breed. So in the first class, Fenway Frenchman's all by himself, effectively not against Gammon's request. She brings him forward. He's now eligible for later. In the next class, 403 French Bulldogs Open dogs, now Mary places Champion Gammon's request over Fenway Frenchman. And by her own admission in the judge's excerpts, she describes exactly why she immediately felt regret for giving the first place to Gammon's request instead of Fenway Frenchman. And she goes into great detail talking about the head, the body, and she realized that she actually preferred Fenway Frenchman.
I thought it over carefully and decided that, as I had undertaken the task of judging the biggest and most important show of the year, I must judge the dogs entirely as they appeared at the moment, apart from my own feelings, as regard to their qualifications, and as nearly as possible to the requirements of the standard, not as I knew of them in the home and by past performance, and unbiased by opinions of others. I had never seen Fenway Frenchman, and, if there was any question of personal preference in my mind, it was towards Riquet.
So this leads us to the final class for Winter's Dog. And this is where Mary reverses her decision. And she outlines this again in great detail. Was criticized for it heavily, but then also congratulated by others for being brave and courageous. And here's where, in my opinion, Mary Winthrop Turner is brilliant. Because, wait for it. Here we go. In color, Frenchman is rich, dark brindle, while Riquet is more of a silvery brindle, a color that I like, but we must remember our standard says regarding color, dark brindle is preferred. And to top it off, trophies were awarded on behalf of Mary Winthrop Turner, Samuel Goldenberg, Lennox, and Grant Nauman to the other dog. And again, they wrote a lot about this because it was so unusual for somebody to stand up and override their original decision. And she was given a lot of credit about how that she had had the courage to do something like that. It's pretty amazing, really, when you put it all in perspective, that this runaway orphan, Gilded Age, chorus girl, ex-nun reinvented herself and became one of the most influential and successful competitors, breeders, judges of the French Bulldog breed in America at the height of its early start. And in 1922, she was actually supposed to judge the specialty again, but had to drop out because of illness. And other than some news articles talking about the dispersal of Never Neverland kennels and the sale of Hunk's Bequest, that littermate to Champion Gammon's Requette, he was actually sold to Mrs. Donald Armerland and was exported to England, becoming a cornerstone of the breed in the UK. And just like that, Mary Winthrop Turner disappeared. There's no record of her passing away. She's not buried with Thomas Monroe Turner, and she's not buried with her family, the Higleys. In some ways, it's almost as if she didn't exist, as if she herself was from Never Neverland. And now you know a little something more about Mary.